Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted. This is now available in video form on YouTube, as well as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify and iTunes, and on the Watch Chronicler website of course, and any other media player of podcasts which you can find. Now, we see an awful lot of watches and watch movements released every year, and for the most part they pass by without making too much of an impact on the way we enjoy watches. However, the central aim of Watch Chronicler in our articles, videos and podcasts is to show the watches which deserve attention and consideration, and so now and then something comes along which just can't be ignored, and today it's something coming from Japan. At the weekend, Watch Chronicler hosts a review of the Grand Seiko SBGM221 GMT Elegance, which I certainly encourage you to take a look at. However, some people expressed interest in the latest generation of Grand Seiko movements in the comments section, and in this episode of Watch Chronicler Unscripted, I'd like to present to you just why this next generation Grand Seiko movement could be a real game changer for Japanese watchmaking, and also presents a totally new future for Grand Seiko as a brand. Of course, if you enjoy this video and podcast, then remember to like, share and subscribe. It's much appreciated and it really does help. Also, head over to the Watch Chronicler website to read full articles and see other podcasts and videos. Now, to give you a bit of background before I go straight into these new two movements coming from Grand Seiko, I think it's worth looking at the industry because watches are something which remain relatively niche in terms of looking at the absolute details, but I think it's crucial to look at the way in which different brands have changed the way they make watches recently. Of course, the last decade has shown an awful lot of this, with Tudor, for example, and Omega directing the watch industry with their new practical in-house movements. But Grand Seiko has been a brand which, for quite a long time, hasn't really received the attention which I personally believe it deserved. And what I mean by this is the fact that Grand Seiko, as a mechanical watchmaker, really has only existed in the scope of modern purchases since the very late 1990s, when they offered the first 9S automatic caliber. Since then, of course, they've spread their family of watches into three selections: their quartz movements, their mechanical movements and their spring drive movements, with spring drive being the most adventurous, you could say, combining the accuracy of quartz with the long-term durability, reliability and also serviceability of a mechanical movement. And then of course mechanical movements form the most traditional aspect of their watchmaking, but for many people also the most appealing area to go for, because these movements have that reliability and also the option to be serviced and repaired long into the future, which still remains an uncertainty with spring drive, bearing in mind that no one apart from Seiko and Grand Seiko are able to service it. Crucially though, Seiko and Grand Seiko have always taken a typically pragmatic approach to their movements, often decorated with admittedly beautiful finishing, but really only on their more expensive models. These movements have shown a level of durability and sheer toughness, you could say, which isn't characteristic of a lot of Swiss endeavours. And what I mean by this is that a lot of Swiss movements and German movements go in for complexity when they innovate to create new movements, whilst they look to older movements like older ETA designs, for example older Laventure designs, for reliable counterparts. Seiko and Grand Seiko though took the approach of trying to recreate these in modern form, and so Seiko affordable movements are very widespread in the industry just because of how tough they are and how well designed they are, as well as the fact that Grand Seiko movements represent a quite wonderful balance between genuine durability and accuracy in production and an underlying fascination and interest of having a unique movement. But they've changed their family of watches this year with two new families. They've added these new models to the 9S and 9R collections, 9S being automatic and mechanical, and 9R being spring drive. And with these two aims, I get the sense that Seiko and Grand Seiko by extension are trying to push these collections in different directions rather than competing with each other. They've tried to move their spring drive movement in a direction to be the ultimate high-tech piece with specifications which move even further away from what can be countered by a mechanical movement, and they've tried to move their very clever 9S movement in the form of the 9S A5, this new architecture for their mechanical movement, in a direction which can genuinely compete for the average collector who enjoys mechanical watches with the likes of Patek Philippe and Erlangen-Söhne. Let's begin with Grand Seiko's 9S collection, which is to say their mechanical line, to start off this podcast, because I think it's important to consider what already exists within Grand Seiko. Now, mechanical movements for Grand Seiko are in many ways not viewed as their flagship line. That, at the present time, is spring drive. And this means that spring drive has the edge when it comes to Grand Seiko's top-of-the-line £40,000 or £50,000 models. However, for watches costing less than this and of a mechanical design, the 9S movements have been a very stable platform for the development of complications, but again, they haven't seen the sheer number of complications incorporated into spring drive. Notably, we see three-hand models in both manually wound and automatic forms, mostly automatic, of course, to fit with the general market interest, as well as the availability of GMT versions. There are also high beat models, so the average Grand Seiko movement runs at 4 Hz or 28,800 vibrations per hour, the beat rate you're familiar with if you wear an average Swiss watch with an ETA movement. These will usually have this 8 tick per second beat rate. Grand Seiko have a history of producing high beat movements. This was the case in the late 60s and early 70s, and this is something they rekindled with their new movements. And these movements tend to add a couple of extra joules to the movement and increase the beat rate to 10 ticks a second or 36,000 vibrations per hour. And in the past, this has been at the expense of power reserve. Accuracy has gone up marginally, but mostly it's been a power reserve change, whereby these movements would have a 55-hour power reserve to the 72 hours of the standard beat rate movements. And for me, at least, as a buyer, I favoured the longer power reserve when compared to the high beat, just out of sheer practicality. And also their finishing was never extremely beautiful. It's certainly good quality, but it's not designed to impress someone who wants a high horology piece. Sure, I think it's probably about equal to the likes of Omega and Rolex, but it's not a match for Patek Philippe, for example, or Lange. Those sit in a higher range. All, however, has changed with this new movement, which is called the 9S A5. The 9S A5 has been put into a gold dress watch, a beautiful piece, in fact, in the form of the limited edition SLGH003 made in 100 pieces. And this piece hasn't been delivered yet. It'll be delivered in the late parts of this year, around August, September, October, that sort of time. And it's an exquisite piece, but to be honest, the value of the watch pales in comparison to the movement at its core, which is this new 9S A5. And the 9S A5 remains a mechanical, automatic caliber with many of the same features we've seen on existing Grand Seiko movements. However, it's now a movement which can genuinely compete with the likes of German watchmakers. And also this, knowing the Japanese, is going to be a properly industrially made movement, which means that it's going to be a movement which can be replicated in many pieces, which means ultimately it could well be more reliable than Lange alternatives too, which is something often levelled at the small production Swiss and German brands, that their movements are exquisite but don't enjoy sufficient testing because of the small numbers. I doubt that'll be the case with this movement. But in essence, you could simply read the specs list and say that this is a comprehensive improvement on what's been previously offered, where previous movements which ran at the high beat rate only had a 55-hour power reserve. This now offers an 80-hour power reserve. Likewise, its design is beautiful. It's 15% thinner than previous Grand Seiko automatic movements of this nature, and this is already an improvement, bearing in mind the connotations of automatic movements from Japan being a bit on the thick side. And the reason why it's 15% thinner rather, is because this movement uses 2 spring barrels in series rather than a single larger one, which has the additional byproduct of allowing a longer power reserve, but means that you get a slimmer movement. And the fact that they're in series means that you get the averaging out of power. You don't have a direct curve of peak torque when the movement is fully wound, and far less torque when it's beginning to wind down, because you essentially have 2 peaks from both of the spring barrels, which evens things out and should give better accuracy. The movement also sees a thorough redesign of the escapement. Now, previously, Grand Seiko movements have included MEMS, which is a very clever process, which is not dissimilar to 3D printing, whereby you can produce much lighter escapements, which allows you to have a longer power reserve, not by increasing the size of the spring, but just by reducing the weight of these components, which is a very clever approach and frankly an obvious approach, but the technology needed to do it is far from easy to innovate and create. But an area where this movement has had to move forward to compete with European rivals is with the escapement itself. And this is housed, of course, in the usual arrangement by a balance wheel, which now has variable inertia weights, which you can move around in terms of how far out they are to control the speed of movement, or the period, rather, you should perhaps say, of a single oscillation of the balance wheel, thus giving you more control over that and more stability. So it has a free-sprung balance. There is now also a new overcoil on the hairspring, which hasn't been seen previously with Japanese and Grand Seiko movements. Most importantly, this new escapement features a whole new design which Grand Seiko call a dual impulse escapement. And this has a similar sort of function to a Daniels coaxial escapement seen in Omega and also in Roger Smith's work. And these escapements are designed to reduce friction in essence. So you have a pushing force between the jewel and the escape wheel rather than a sliding force as in a lever escapement. And this means that you don't have the friction which is inherent to those styles of movements. This means, of course, longer service intervals, greater reliability and greater accuracy. But there is an efficiency increase as well. It's not as radical as a coaxial escapement in the sense that you have that pushing force in one direction and the return spin of the balance wheel offers energy in the opposite direction. But you do still see 3 pallets instead of 2 on a normal lever escapement, and significantly enhanced efficiency, which is central to the function of this movement. Most importantly though, and for the first time in a Grand Seiko automatic movement, we see the same magic in terms of design and detailing as has been seen in the past in the spring drive movements from this brand. And what I mean by this is that the movement design is clearly done intentionally. The rotor, for example, for automatic winding is stunningly sculpted with beveled edges exquisitely done all around, as seen on all of the bridges within this movement, including the balance bridge, which is no longer a one-sided balance cock, but a full balance bridge to give a greater shock resistance and stability. The screws are now thermally blued, and there's the same approach to trying to mimic the landscape around the factories and key landmarks in Grand Seiko, as seen on spring drive movements, with some elements like, for example, the silhouette of Mount Iwate visible in the bridges, and the Shizukyushu River also stated to appear within the shape of the bridges. And it's this kind of attention which I think will take this movement into the future. Of course, this watch is currently being offered in a £33,000 watch, so this movement is still far away from being available in affordable steel Grand Seikos, and I wonder whether we'll see it at all. I don't mean to say that in a sort of a cynical way, but what I mean is that we don't see the exquisite manually wound Grand Seiko spring drive movements available in affordable pieces. Instead, they get much more pedestrian-looking movements. And so whilst I think we'll see a trickle down of the technology in this movement, I have a suspicion that this movement will remain specifically for the market of the top-of-the-line Grand Seikos, as Grand Seiko tries to encroach on a market previously only commanded by European counterparts. The other aspect of this new range of Grand Seiko movements is a new spring drive calibre. Now, spring drive has often been heralded as the top of the range in Grand Seiko's eyes of their own collection, and this is certainly supported by the fact that their top of the range high horology offerings from Credor and Grand Seiko use spring drive movements in a manually wound form. However, it does seem that in addition to that automatic movement which we've just seen, which brings Grand Seiko automatic and mechanical movements to a higher level, that they are innovating for more affordable spring drive too, conversely. And this is suggested by the fact that their new movement is called the 9R A5, and essentially takes what we already recognise from Grand Seiko spring drive and offers it in a brand new, very different looking package. Now, the appearance, just speaking from the most superficial aspect first, is different. It's not better, it's not worse. Now, this watch, first of all, this movement rather, is being offered in an £8,350 limited edition of 700 pieces watch, which is a 600 metre dive watch in the form of the SLGA001. And the important aspect of this is that it's not a terribly overtly decorated movement. It's very much at the same sort of level as you would expect from Omega or Rolex at this same price. A lot of the surface of the movement is simply matted, but we can see from the early pictures that the edges have been beveled, albeit not extensively, but they have been beveled, whilst there is some perlage throughout the movement, and so there is a clear appearance of care taken with this movement, in addition to blued screws, which I think is extremely appealing too. The headline with this movement, though, is a 5-day power reserve, and this matches the increased 80-hour power reserve of the new automatic movement, but of course is greater at 120 hours. And what's important here is they've taken a similar perspective and approach with 2 spring barrels rather than one larger one. And so this gives you a smoother torque delivery, of course, although bearing in mind the way spring drive releases energy, it's fairly clear to say that this wouldn't have been a problem in the first place. But this also means that bidirectional winding works better for this longer power reserve, because in the past, Grand Seiko movements with longer power reserves had to use reversers rather than Seiko's conventional magic lever arrangement, because these worked better for longer power reserves. However, with this new setup, whereby you have the spring energy, the potential energy within the springs spread between 2 springs rather than just a single large one, this now works, and it's a very reliable technology. So it's nice to see this included within this movement. This is no bad thing for previous reverser-based movements, but it is nice to see the fact that they're using their own technology here because they're able to innovate around an existing problem. It's also worth noting that this choice was driven by making a thinner movement too. This movement is now only 5mm thick, and the crucial aspect of this was the fact that their springs added height, but also their gear trains added height, and so now the gear train is under just one bridge in the middle of the movement. There is an addition to this concept in the sense that having one bridge means also they've been able to reduce the thickness. So 5mm thick, this movement is still a bit thicker than some average mechanical movements, but it's an awful lot better than what we saw previously. Now, the design of the movement is different too, where you look at the rotor, for instance, which is redesigned, and there's less of a view of the glide wheel of the spring drive setup. But there's some technology too in the fact that this watch is now more accurate than previous generations of spring drive. And it's actually 50% more accurate in the sense that now it's accurate 10 seconds a month rather than 15. And these benefits have been driven by the fact that there's been work on the integrated circuit and the quartz crystal in order to improve the overall accuracy. But most importantly, this is the first spring drive movement to be thermocompensated, something seen on the very best quartz movements, and thus befitting a place in a semi-quartz movement like these. Speaking of those quartz crystals though, this quartz crystal is aged for 3 months and very carefully selected, which means that once it's been fitted within its vacuum-filled capsule, this crystal shouldn't be affected by surrounding environments, which is of course crucial both for the dive watch this piece is housed in, but also for the future as a general-purpose spring drive movement. And so it seems like with this movement, Grand Seiko is looking to change the way spring drive is perceived and give it a more technical feel, where their mechanical movements get a more sort of sentimental mechanical feel. And so I look forward to seeing what Grand Seiko do in future with these. Before I conclude this podcast and video though, I would like to give one sort of prediction for this spring drive movement. I've made it quite clear that I think that for the foreseeable future, that mechanical movement will be something of a top-tier halo product for Grand Seiko, and I'm not surprised, because it rivals the very best Switzerland and Germany can throw at them. But with this new spring drive movement, I suspect that it's because, whereas with Grand Seiko mechanical movements, the movements used in even the highest level of prospects and technical watches from the more affordable Seiko brand, you don't see the 9S movements. You see 8L movements, which are very closely related to Grand Seiko movements, but still don't have the finishing and aren't quite at the level with the same power reserve and ultimate features. With spring drive, this isn't the case, because watches like the Landmaster and, more recently, new Presage models have an exhibition caseback with a semi-decorated spring drive movement, which is mechanically identical to what we see in Grand Seiko, and bearing in mind the intention to separate these two brands, I think it's only logical that Grand Seiko launches a new spring drive offering to still have the upper hand and prevent people from simply going for Seiko as a more affordable offering with the same technology. But tell me what you think of these hypotheses and these thoughts in the comments section below, and what you think the future of Grand Seiko entails. But thank you very much for listening, and do remember to like, share and subscribe, and follow us on whatever platform you're listening to this on, because it really helps and it allows us to make more podcasts, articles and videos. So thank you very much for listening. This is Armon from watchchronicler.com, out.